There is a kind of silence that does not belong to the natural world. You have heard natural silence, the quiet of a forest at 3 a.m, the breathless pause between thunderclaps, the stillness of snowfall in an empty field. Natural silence has a texture to it. It has biological residue, a distant owl, the creak of a tree branch adjusting to cold air, the whisper of wind moving through grass. Natural silence is never total, because life does not permit totality. Life always inserts itself, always adds its small signatures to the ambient record of a living planet. The silence around Archuleta Mesa is different. It is the kind of silence that you notice after you've been standing in it for several minutes, the kind that registers not in your ears but somewhere in the older architecture of your nervous system, in the part of you that evolved to identify environments where the normal rules of the world had been suspended. Animals notice this kind of silence before humans do. Dogs stop at certain distances from the mesa and will not proceed. Birds alter their flight paths. The cattle that used to graze in the lower pastures north of Dulce showed a behavioural avoidance of specific areas near the mesa's base that the ranchers who watched them noticed and remarked upon to anyone who would listen, long before anyone was paying close attention to what the cattle themselves were being subjected to. The town of Dulce, New Mexico, sits at an elevation of roughly 6,900 feet on the Colorado Plateau, nestled against the southern slopes of the Jicarilla Mountains within the boundaries of the Jicarilla Apache Nation. The population has hovered around 2,000 for most of the past half-century, the kind of number that produces a community small enough to be intimate and large enough to have witnessed things collectively, to have generated a shared memory of events that the wider world was never told about. The main road through town is paved. The surrounding roads diminish quickly from paved to gravel to dirt to track to something that is only navigable by someone who already knows where they're going. The mesa rises to the north of town like a geological sovereign, broad-shouldered and permanent, its layered sandstone face reading the accumulated history of 200 million years of planetary time, with an indifference to human presence that feels, if you spend enough time looking at it, almost deliberate. This is the place where the story begins. Not because stories need a place. Stories need only people and events, and the willingness to follow truth wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere that every institutional voice in the room is instructing you not to go. But this particular story is inseparable from this particular geography, from the specific combination of remoteness and geology, and federal land status and historical accident that made this mesa, this town, this stretch of high desert in northern New Mexico the location that someone, or something, chose for purposes that 50 years of investigation have not fully illuminated, and that official silence has consistently and deliberately refused to examine. What happened in Dulce, or what the evidence suggests happened, or what the people who were there and the people who came after them, and the people who died before they could finish telling what they knew, all agree, in their separate and uncollaborated ways, happened, is one of the most extensively documented and deliberately suppressed stories in the modern history of the American Southwest. It involves cattle and blood and precision cuts made by instruments that leave no trace of their origin. It involves nuclear detonations and geological surveys and the creative bureaucratic architecture of programs that do not appear in any public budget. It involves a man who built underground structures for the United States government and who spent the final year of his life telling anyone who would listen exactly what he had found in the dark, and who was dead at 44 under circumstances that a rubber catheter and a missing medications bottle and a ransacked filing cabinet made very difficult to accept as self-inflicted. It involves the question of what is beneath the mesa, and it involves the growing, deepening, increasingly difficult to dismiss suspicion that whatever is beneath the mesa is not only still there, but has never stopped operating. The story does not start with conspiracy, it starts with livestock. The summer of 1975 arrived in the high desert of northern New Mexico the way it always does, with a shift in the quality of light that happens almost overnight. a deepening and intensifying of the gold and amber tones in the landscape that announces the shift from the cool clarity of spring into the particular fullness of high-altitude summer. The ranchers of the Dulce area had been working their land for generations in some cases. They knew the rhythms of the desert the way you only know something when your livelihood depends on reading it correctly. They knew what a healthy herd looked like. They knew the way cattle behaved when they were stressed. They knew, without having to think about it, every predator that shared their range, coyote, mountain lion, bear, and they knew precisely what each predator did to the animals it killed. None of them had ever seen anything like what they began finding in the summer of 1975, and what continued to appear with a regularity that transformed initial shock into a sustained, grinding dread through 1976 and beyond. The animals were dead. That part was conventional enough. Cattle die. They die from illness, from predator attacks, from exposure, from any number of causes that a rancher factors into the annual arithmetic of a working operation. But the manner of death in these cases was not any cause that any rancher in the area had ever encountered. The animals showed no signs of distress prior to death. No running, no defensive injury, no evidence that they had been chased or attacked in any way that left the kinds of physical evidence that a pursuit and kill event invariably produces. They simply appeared, in the morning hours when ranchers made their checks, in the places where the night had left them with specific parts removed. Not torn, not chewed, not broken, removed. With a precision that transformed the carcass from the site of an animal's death into something that resembled the result of a surgical procedure conducted under controlled conditions by someone with both an extensive knowledge of bovine anatomy and access to instruments capable of making incisions that left edges so clean, so perfectly bounded, so entirely free of the ragged tissue trauma that any conventional cutting instrument produces, that the veterinary professionals who examined them were, in some cases, visibly unsettled. An ear, removed from the base of the skull with a single continuous cut that followed the exact boundary of the auricular cartilage. The tongue, extracted from the oral cavity through an opening that had been made in the underside of the jaw, reaching to a depth that would have required either very long instruments or the disassembly of the jaw structure, neither of which had occurred. The jaw was intact, the opening was small and precise, and the tongue was simply gone, removed as cleanly as if it had been placed on a surgical tray. The eyes, in most cases. The genitals, in virtually all cases. In some animals, organs that would have required incisions through the body wall, the stomach, the heart, sections of intestine, had been removed through openings that did not tear the surrounding muscle or disturb the adjacent tissue in any way that was consistent with manual extraction. In cases where laboratory analysis was possible, the cut edges showed evidence of heat treatment, a cauterization effect that sealed the wound even as it was made, as though the instrument that created the opening was simultaneously cutting and closing, operating at a speed or with a technology that prevented the bleeding that any cut to living tissue, or recently living tissue, invariably produces. And then there was the blood, the absence specifically of blood, not reduced blood, not blood that had pooled and drained away, no blood. On the animal, at the site of the wounds, on the ground for a radius that investigators searched carefully and repeatedly. A 2-year-old heifer contains approximately 12 gallons of blood. Every one of those gallons was missing from the scene, missing not in the sense that it had drained into the soil. Ground soaks blood in ways that leave evidence, discoloration, thickening, changes in the surrounding vegetation and insect activity, but missing in the sense that it had been removed, taken, as neatly and completely as the organs. Gabe Valdez was the man who had to figure out what to make of all this. He was a New Mexico State police officer assigned to the Dulce area, a practical man in a practical job in a practical part of the world, where the most common call was a traffic incident or a domestic dispute or a boundary conflict between ranchers, the ordinary inventory of rural law enforcement. When the first mutilation reports came to his desk in the summer of 1975, he treated them as he treated everything, as problems to be worked through methodically, with evidence at the centre and speculation at the margins. He drove out to the ranches. He photographed the carcasses in detail, building a visual record that would eventually run to hundreds of images. He collected tissue samples and sent them to veterinary laboratories at the state university. He documented the perimeter of each site, looking for tracks, for physical evidence of how the animals had been approached, for anything that might indicate the method of death and the method of tissue removal. He interviewed every rancher who made a report, and then he interviewed their neighbours, and then he interviewed the neighbours' neighbours, building the widest possible net of information around the events. What came back from the laboratories confirmed what the ranchers had already known from visual inspection. The cuts were not made by animal teeth or claws or any conventional blade. The precision was extraordinary. The heat treatment at the wound edges was real and measurable. The absence of blood was not an artifact of how the samples had been collected or processed. It was a genuine characteristic of the carcasses. And the insect activity, which forensic entomologists would use in subsequent analyses of similar events across the American West, was anomalous in a specific and meaningful way. Flies and beetles that would ordinarily colonize a fresh carcass within hours were, at these sites, absent or dramatically reduced in number, as though something about the condition of the animals was rendering them unattractive as a substrate for insect activity, which required some property of the tissue that no conventional explanation adequately accounted for. The tracks that Valdez found near several of the carcasses have remained among the most discussed physical evidence in the entire Dulce file. They were not animal tracks. They were not human footprints. They were impressions in the soil that had a regularity of spacing and a consistency of depth, and a geometry that Valdez, who had worked enough crime scenes to be able to read physical evidence with practiced eyes, could not reconcile with anything biological. The impressions were approximately circular, roughly 8 to 10 inches in diameter, sunk to a uniform depth of about an inch regardless of the varying softness of the surrounding soil, and spaced with a mechanical consistency, the same distance apart in the same geometric relationship site after site. Not the variable pressure-dependent spacing of an animal gait, not the organic irregularity of human footsteps on uneven terrain. Something else. Something that moved with a uniformity of applied force and spatial distribution that suggested not legs but landing pads, not walking but touching down and lifting off, repeatedly, with the precision of a mechanism rather than the variability of a biological limb. Then there were the objects. In the case files that Valdez maintained with a thoroughness that exceeded what his posting required of him, he was not under any institutional pressure to pursue these investigations as deeply as he did. The pressure he felt was internal, the pressure of a person who has looked at something he does not understand and cannot let it go. There are references to physical artifacts found near some of the mutilation sites. He described them as mask-like in shape, fabricated from a material he could not identify, and bearing no markings or features that gave any indication of their origin or purpose. These objects disappeared from the evidence record before they could be subjected to the kind of laboratory analysis that might have produced meaningful data. The chain of custody, in at least 2 cases, simply ends. The objects were logged, transferred to a law enforcement facility for storage, and then, when subsequent requests were made for them, were reported as either missing or never having arrived. This kind of evidence disappearance, which researchers would document repeatedly across multiple categories of physical evidence connected to the Dulce investigation, does not happen by accident. Physical evidence logged and transferred through official channels does not simply cease to exist unless someone with the authority and the motive to remove it has done so. The helicopters were perhaps the element that Valdez found most disturbing in his years of investigation, because unlike the wound patterns and the missing blood and the enigmatic tracks, helicopters were human technology, and their persistent appearance in the windows of time surrounding the mutilation events implied a human role in whatever was occurring. They were not commercial aircraft. They were not the agricultural spraying operations that occasionally work the area. They were unmarked, dark-coloured rotary wing aircraft that flew at night without lights, at altitudes that kept them below standard radar coverage, along routes that Valdez began to map after tracking enough sightings from enough witnesses over enough months to start seeing the patterns in their behaviour. The patterns were not random. The flight corridors, when plotted on a map of the region, converged on a specific area, the land around and above Archuleta Mesa. Not every flight. Not in a way that was so obvious a casual observer would have noticed it, without the accumulated mapping that Valdez had done, but with a statistical consistency that, when Valdez looked at his maps in the evenings after his official duties were done, made the back of his neck prickle in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The helicopters came from the mesa, or they went to the mesa, or they orbited the mesa in patterns that suggested observation rather than transit, and they appeared again and again in the nights immediately before or after mornings when ranchers would find that the surgery had been conducted on another of their animals. Valdez reported all of this. He reported it to his superiors at the New Mexico State Police. He reported it to the FBI office that eventually, under congressional pressure in the late 1970s, opened a nominal investigation into the cattle mutilation phenomenon. He reported it to researchers and journalists who came to Dulce because the story had begun to seep into the wider cultural conversation through the kinds of channels that official suppression cannot fully close: local newspapers, regional radio, the word-of-mouth networks of rural communities who tell each other what is happening, because they do not have the luxury of institutional authority to tell them it is not important. The FBI's investigation, conducted between 1979 and 1980 under the direction of Special Agent Ken Rommel, produced a report of some length and essentially no substance. The report attributed the mutilations to natural predator activity in carrion scavengers, and to what it characterised as the overwrought imaginations of ranchers unfamiliar with the normal processes of animal decomposition. Gabe Valdez, who by the time the report was released had documented hundreds of incidents and accumulated a body of physical and testimonial evidence that would have been considered significant in any honest investigative context, received this conclusion with a degree of contained fury that those who knew him described as one of the more restrained reactions a man could have to being told, in official language, that everything he had carefully documented had not actually happened. He continued investigating on his own time. He continued until the end of his life. He died in 2010, still asking questions that no official body had ever genuinely tried to answer. To understand why Gabe Valdez's questions were never answered, you have to understand the geography of secrecy that surrounded the place where he was asking them. Northern New Mexico in the 1970s was not simply a remote stretch of high desert. It was the deep operational hinterland of the most extensive complex of classified defense and nuclear research facilities in the world. Within a radius of roughly 150 miles from Dulce, you had Los Alamos National Laboratory, which had been the birthplace of the atomic bomb and remained the most significant nuclear weapons research facility in the United States. You had Sandia National Laboratories, which handled the engineering and systems integration of the nuclear weapons program. You had Kirtland Air Force Base, which maintained nuclear weapons storage and served as a hub for classified aerospace programs. You had White Sands Missile Range, where generations of American weapon systems had been tested in the isolation of the Chihuahuan Desert. You had Holloman Air Force Base. You had a web of smaller facilities and monitoring stations and research outposts that existed in the classified bureaucratic ecosystem that surrounded the public institutions like the unseen portion of an iceberg. This geography of secrecy had specific practical consequences for anyone attempting to investigate unusual phenomena in the region. The classification infrastructure of the national laboratories extended well beyond their physical boundaries. Personnel who worked at Los Alamos lived in the surrounding communities and were bound by security agreements that, in some cases, covered not just their work but their observations and communications more broadly. The culture of institutional silence that the nuclear program had cultivated over decades, a culture in which not asking about things you were not authorized to know was as important as not telling things you were authorized to know, permeated the social fabric of northern New Mexico in ways that were subtle and pervasive and largely invisible to anyone who had not grown up inside it. when strange things happened in this environment, the default response of the people most likely to have relevant knowledge was not to tell. It was to say nothing, and to maintain that nothing with the practiced ease of people, for whom institutional silence was not an unusual burden, but a lifetime habit. Into this environment, something had been added in December of 1967 that the public record acknowledges and the conspiracy framework interprets in a way that is either paranoid or incisive, depending on your starting assumptions. Project Gas Buggy was real. Every element of its official description is documentable. It was part of the Plowshare Program, a genuine initiative of the United States Atomic Energy Commission that ran from 1958 to 1973 with the stated goal of finding industrial applications for nuclear explosives. The program detonated 27 nuclear devices in total in locations across the American West, for purposes that range from the ambitious to the absurd: harbour excavation in Alaska, canal construction in Panama, natural gas stimulation in Colorado and New Mexico. Project Gas Buggy was the natural gas stimulation experiment conducted in partnership with the El Paso Natural Gas Company at a site in the Carson National Forest in Rio Arriba County, New Mexico, approximately 30 miles southwest of Dulce, on December 10th, 1967, at 10 o'clock in the morning. A 29-kiloton nuclear device was detonated at a depth of 4,240 feet below the surface. The explosion fractured the surrounding rock formation, releasing natural gas trapped within it. The gas, when subsequently tested, was found to contain tritium and other radioactive isotopes at levels that made commercial use impractical. The project was evaluated as a partial technical success and an economic failure. The Plowshare Program continued for a few more years with other experiments before being terminated in the early 1970s. That is what the public record says. Now consider what the public record does not say, and what the geography and geology of the region make it reasonable to ask. A 29-kiloton nuclear detonation at 4,000 feet creates a pressure wave that travels outward through the surrounding rock in every direction simultaneously. The characteristics of that pressure wave as it moves, its amplitude, its frequency, its interaction with the specific formations it encounters, are functions of the geological structure through which it is propagating. In a region as geologically complex as northern New Mexico, with its ancient volcanic intrusions and its extensive limestone formations, and its well-documented networks of natural cave systems and subsurface voids, the propagation of that pressure wave is not a simple radiating sphere of uniform energy. It is a complex three-dimensional interaction between the wave and the geological structure, and it produces, in the rock through which it passes, a record of that structure, a seismic tomography in effect of everything between the blast point and wherever the wave's energy finally dissipates. The Atomic Energy Commission would have known this. The geophysicists working on Project Gas Buggy would have known this. The seismic monitoring equipment deployed around the blast site to study the explosion's effects would have recorded in considerable detail exactly how the pressure wave interacted with the surrounding geology, which means it would have produced, as a byproduct of the natural gas stimulation experiment, an extremely detailed map of the subsurface geological structure of a region that included the area beneath Archuleta Mesa. Some of this seismic data is publicly available. Some of it remains classified. The classification of seismic data from a natural gas stimulation experiment conducted in 1967 has never been explained in terms that connect to any specific national security concern related to natural gas. The explanation most commonly offered, when any explanation is offered at all, is that the data contains information about nuclear device design that could be exploited by foreign powers, a rationale that has been used to justify the classification of an enormous variety of Plowshare Program data, and that may in some cases be genuine, and in others may be the bureaucratic equivalent of a closed door with a sign on it that says nothing to see here. The conspiracy interpretation does not require that Project Gas Buggy was secretly intended to excavate an underground base. That would be a reach beyond what the evidence supports. What it requires is something more modest and more plausible. that the geological survey data generated by Project Gasbuggy gave certain people within the classified defence establishment a detailed and actionable picture of the subsurface terrain beneath Archuleta Mesa, and that this picture informed decisions that were made in the subsequent decade about what could be built beneath that mesa, and how and to what depth, and with what connection to the natural geological features already present. The natural features already present were extensive. The Archuleta Mesa sits atop a geological formation that geologists have long recognised as containing significant natural cave systems. The limestone and sandstone strata of the Colorado Plateau in this region are riddled with solution caves, fracture caves, and collapse features that create natural underground spaces of widely varying sizes. Some of these spaces are known and mapped. Some have been entered by cavers and documented in the speleological record. Some almost certainly remain undetected by any systematic survey, existing in darkness and silence at depths where the weight of the rock above them is the only witness to their presence. Natural cave systems of the right scale, in the right geological context with the right access points, represent a significant engineering advantage to anyone planning an underground installation. You do not need to remove all the rock yourself. You need to identify what the rock has already removed for you over millions of years of geological time, and then connect those spaces, reinforce them where necessary, and build within the framework that nature has already provided. The construction footprint is smaller. The excavated material that needs to be disposed of is less. The acoustic and seismic signature of the construction is reduced, and the resulting facility is more naturally adapted to the underground environment than anything built entirely from scratch, because it sits within a structure that has already proven its stability over timescales that no human construction project can match. If the seismic data from Project Gasbuggy showed what the conspiracy framework suggests it showed, a network of natural subsurface spaces beneath Archuleta Mesa of significant extent and appropriate depth, then the subsequent appearance of industrial drilling equipment near the mesa in the mid-1970s, which multiple residents of the Dulce area reported seeing, and which no public works project explained, begins to look less like an anomaly and more like a logical next step. But before we go underground, we need to go back even further. We need to go back to 1954, because the story of what is allegedly beneath Archuleta Mesa cannot be told without the story of how it allegedly came to be there, and that story begins not in New Mexico, but in California, on a February evening when the President of the United States was somewhere he was not officially supposed to be, doing something he was not officially supposed to be doing. Dwight David Eisenhower was 53 days into his second year as president when he disappeared on the evening of February 20th, 1954. He was vacationing at the Smoke Tree Ranch in Palm Springs, California, taking a brief respite from the machinery of the presidency in the way that commanders-in-chief were still permitted to do before the relentless media scrutiny of later decades made genuine privacy essentially impossible. The White House press corps, stationed nearby as they always were, noticed his absence from the public schedule and began making inquiries. The response from the White House press office was a story about a dental emergency, a cap lost from a tooth, an urgent visit to a local dentist, nothing to be concerned about. A dentist was subsequently produced to confirm that the president had been his patient that evening. The dental story was plausible. It was the kind of story that satisfied the immediate need for an explanation without inviting further inquiry, because dental emergencies are personal and mildly embarrassing, and nobody looks too hard at a story that contains those properties. The reporters accepted it. The story was printed, and for years that is where it sat, in the flat, mundane category of minor presidential trivia. It did not stay there. Beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s, a series of individuals who claimed knowledge of the Eisenhower administration's classified activities began telling a different story about the evening of February 20th, 1954. Not a dental appointment, a meeting. At either Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, about 2 hours by air from Palm Springs, or at Edwards Air Force Base in California, which was significantly closer and more logistically convenient for a brief, unannounced departure, Eisenhower allegedly met with representatives of an extraterrestrial civilization. This claim exists in a space that is, from an evidentiary standpoint, extraordinarily difficult to evaluate. The people who have made it most directly include individuals who occupied positions within the intelligence and military establishment of the relevant period, positions that gave them both the theoretical access to such information and the institutional motivation to keep it secret until a point in their lives when the cost of continued silence became greater than the cost of disclosure. The corroboration between independent accounts is more substantial than dismissers of the claim typically acknowledge. The specific details that multiple sources have provided, the location, the date, the general nature of the alleged communication, the specific terms that were discussed, overlap in ways that are more consistent with shared experience than with shared fabrication. What is said to have been discussed and agreed upon at this alleged meeting has shaped, in the conspiracy framework, everything that followed. The entities that Eisenhower allegedly met with had been present in the skies over North America with increasing frequency since at least the late 1940s, when the military began tracking incursions that could not be explained by any known aircraft from any known nation. The frequency and the operational characteristics of these incursions suggested a surveillance mission, a systematic mapping of the human world by observers who were interested in it in ways that were methodical and patient and not immediately threatening but also not comforting. They had been watching for a while, and by February of 1954 they were apparently ready to speak. The agreement that allegedly emerged from these communications, if the accounts of the individuals who claim knowledge of it are to be credited, was transactional in the way that all agreements between parties with asymmetric power are transactional. The extraterrestrials would share certain technologies that, in the context of the 1950s, represented capabilities so far in advance of existing human science that even limited access to the underlying principles could accelerate American military and industrial development by decades. In exchange, the extraterrestrials would be permitted to conduct certain activities on American soil and within American territory that they considered necessary for their own purposes. Chief among these activities, the acquisition of biological samples from human beings and from the animals that human beings used for food. A biological survey, in essence, of the organisms of the North American continent, conducted without public knowledge or consent, but within a framework of government awareness that transformed what might otherwise have been considered an invasion into something that could be filed, in the bureaucratic language of the national security state, as an authorized program. The Dulce area was selected for the joint operations enabled by this agreement, for reasons that, examined in retrospect, have a certain cold logic. The population density in the surrounding region was among the lowest in the continental United States, meaning that unusual activity was less likely to be observed and reported. The land status, a combination of Jicarilla Apache Reservation land and adjacent federal land, created a bureaucratic environment in which civilian oversight was minimal and jurisdictionally complex. The geology was suitable for deep underground construction in ways that the Project Gas Buggy survey had presumably confirmed, and the proximity to the existing classified research infrastructure of the New Mexico Defense Complex meant that personnel could be transferred into and out of the program through institutional channels that were already opaque to public scrutiny, without creating the kind of anomalous paper trail that a completely isolated program would generate. The construction of the alleged facility, by accounts that began circulating in the UFO research community in the 1980s, took place over a period of years in the 1960s and 1970s, using a combination of conventional tunnel boring technology and techniques that the human engineers involved described as being significantly beyond anything available in the public domain. Methods of rock removal and cavity stabilization that operated at speeds and with a precision that the engineering teams found difficult to explain in terms of any technology they had been trained on. The construction proceeded in phases, deepening over time, expanding laterally as the natural cave systems were incorporated into the artificial structure. until the installation reached the configuration that the accounts describe. 7 discrete levels, separated by significant vertical distances, connected by shafts and passages that served both as access routes and as the conduits for the ventilation and power distribution systems that made human habitation at that depth survivable. The first 2 levels, nearest the surface, were dedicated to the security and surveillance apparatus that was the installation's most visible feature from the perspective of the human personnel who worked there. This was where the monitoring systems resided, the cameras and sensors and communication intercept equipment that maintained the facility's awareness of the surface world above it and the approaches to the few access points that connected it to the surface. The personnel at these levels were drawn from the intelligence community rather than the scientific community. Security professionals whose job was to ensure that the installation remained invisible and that anyone who came too close to it, geographically or informationally, was identified and managed before they could constitute a threat to operational security. Below the security levels were the administrative and human research spaces, the laboratories and offices where the human scientists who worked in the installation conducted the overt portions of their programs. These programs, in their official descriptions within the classified bureaucratic structure that surrounded the installation, were extensions of the legitimate defense research being conducted at Los Alamos and Sandia. Materials science, biomedical research, advanced computing. The unclassified face of classified things, the description that could be passed to the relatively small number of officials with budget oversight authority, who needed to be satisfied that the program's enormous costs were producing commensurate value. What was actually happening at the middle levels of the installation was something that the official descriptions did not capture, and that the human researchers who worked there have described in the accounts that have filtered out through the decades since, with a combination of scientific excitement and moral vertigo that suggests people who were doing things they found genuinely extraordinary and genuinely troubling in approximately equal measure. Genetic research was the core discipline, but genetic research of a kind that bore only a distant family resemblance to what was being published in the scientific literature of the same period. The tools and techniques available at the installation, by the accounts of those who worked there, were generations ahead of anything in the public domain, and they enabled experiments that the public scientific community would not acquire the capability to contemplate for decades. The hybridization research, the attempt to combine genetic material from human and non-human sources in configurations that produced viable biological results, is the element of the alleged program that generates the most visceral response in anyone who encounters it, and it is also the element most resistant to objective evaluation, because the emotional weight of the claim tends to overwhelm the evidentiary framework within which it is supposed to be assessed. We will try to describe it as clearly as possible, and as close to the language of those who claim to have witnessed it as we can manage. The program, by these accounts, was not attempting to create monsters. It was attempting to understand life, the deep biological logic that underlies the enormous variety of living forms on this planet and presumably on others. The extraterrestrial participants in the joint program had a biological understanding that exceeded human science not just in its technical specifics, but in its fundamental framework. They understood genetics not as a code to be read, but as a language to be spoken, not as a fixed architecture to be mapped, but as a dynamic system to be engaged. And the experimental program at the middle levels of the installation was, in their view, a basic science project, an exploration of what was possible when the constraints that separate species in nature, the reproductive isolation that keeps genetic lineages separate over evolutionary time, were systematically removed. What was produced in the course of this exploration is described with a reluctance and a careful vagueness in the accounts of those who claim to have seen it, a quality of language that suggests people protecting themselves from the full weight of what they remember. Biological entities is the most common formulation. Not animals, not humans, entities that occupied a category that human biology had not previously needed a word for, because nothing like them had existed in the natural world, and the things that human mythology had imagined in that conceptual space. Chimeras, hybrids, the creatures that lived at the edges of ancient maps, were pale and inaccurate sketches of something that was more deeply strange than imagination had managed to reach. Level 6 in the accounts was dedicated to the storage of biological materials in cryogenic conditions, genetic samples, embryonic materials, specimens of the entities produced by the hybridization program, preserved at temperatures where biological time essentially stopped, waiting for purposes that the storage protocols did not always specify clearly. The scale of the materials stored at this level, if the accounts are accurate, represented decades of accumulated biological research and suggested a program with a timescale and a scope of ambition that exceeded anything that could be attributed to a short-term military research initiative. This was not a program designed to produce a specific result and then be concluded. This was a program designed to continue indefinitely, to build a body of knowledge and biological material that had a value extending far beyond the immediate operational context of any particular treaty or political administration. And then there is Level 7. The people who claim to have been to Level 7, or who claim to have received reliable accounts from those who were, describe it with a consistency that is the most disturbing thing about the entire Dulce narrative. Not consistency in the specific details. Details vary in the way that details always vary when multiple people describe the same thing from different positions and at different times, but consistency in the emotional register of the description. Across multiple independent accounts, spanning more than 3 decades of testimony, the description of the lowest level of the alleged installation carries the same quality. A flat, careful, deliberately controlled language, the language of people who are managing a genuine fear that has not diminished with time. Not the excited language of someone who has seen something wonderful, not the performed language of someone constructing a narrative for effect, the language of people describing as accurately as they can something that frightened them profoundly and that they have never found a way to fully integrate into any framework that makes it less frightening. The entities at Level 7, by these accounts, were not the same as the extraterrestrial participants in the joint research program at the upper levels. Those entities, the ones who had allegedly negotiated the treaty, who worked alongside human scientists in the research levels, who communicated through the AI translation systems that the program had developed, were described with a certain clinical respect as beings whose intelligence was evident and whose intentions were at least comprehensible even when they were not reassuring. The beings at Level 7 were different. They were the products of the program rather than its architects, and the decades of biological experimentation that had produced them had created something that existed at the far edge of what the category of life could accommodate. They moved in the darkness of the 7th level, in ways that the monitoring systems could track, but that human observers could not comfortably watch. They registered as biological by every measure: heat, respiration, metabolic activity. But the behavioural data was wrong in ways that were not easy to articulate and were not easy to stop thinking about. Their relationship to the human personnel who occasionally had reason to access that level was not the relationship of an animal to a human, which is familiar even when it is dangerous, and it was not the relationship of one person to another, which is familiar in a completely different way. It was something that did not have a name, and that the people who experienced it described afterward with the particular disorientation of someone who has encountered a category of experience that their conceptual framework was not built to process. We cannot take you there. We cannot show you what the monitoring cameras allegedly recorded. We can only tell you that the people who claim to have seen those recordings have never, subsequently, been willing to describe them in detail, and have never, in the accounts that have filtered out, found a language adequate to what they witnessed. This is the environment that Philip Schneider claims to have entered in August of 1979, and from which he claims to have barely emerged alive. Philip Schneider was not, by his own account, a senior figure in the classified program. He was an engineer, a geological and structural engineer with a specialty in underground construction, the kind of professional expertise that was in high demand in the classified defence establishment of the 1970s, when the Cold War competition in underground military infrastructure was at one of its peaks. His father, Oskar Schneider, had been a Navy captain with his own alleged connections to classified programs of the wartime and post-war period, connections that Philipp Schneider believed had shaped his own subsequent career in ways he did not fully understand until late in his life. Schneider worked on multiple underground construction projects in his career, and he was not, he insisted in his lectures, ever told the full purpose or context of the facilities he helped build. This was how the classification system worked, and worked deliberately. Engineers knew the specifications they were building to, the geological parameters they were working within, the structural requirements they needed to meet. They did not need to know and were not told what the facility was ultimately for. The knowledge was compartmentalized. The engineer built the structure. Someone else decided what went inside it. In August of 1979, Schneider was part of a construction crew working on an expansion of the underground installation near Dulce. The crew was operating at depth, drilling in an area that the geological survey data had indicated was unoccupied, a natural void or passage that, once connected to the existing installation, would add capacity to a level that was running at operational limits. The drilling proceeded normally for some time, and then the bore broke through. What was on the other side of the rock face that the drill penetrated was not an empty void. The chamber that the crew's lights illuminated when the bore opened was occupied, and the occupants were not human. Schneider described them consistently across his many lectures, with the repetitive detail of someone who has told the same story so many times that they are no longer embellishing it, just retrieving it. Approximately 7 feet tall, with a generally humanoid body plan but with proportions and features that were fundamentally wrong in ways that took a moment to fully register, because the wrongness was subtle before it was overwhelming. The hands had more fingers than human hands, and the fingers were longer and more mobile, and they terminated in something that was not quite a fingernail. The skin was a grey-green that did not look like skin. The eyes were large and dark and without any of the biological familiarity that makes eye contact between humans a form of communication. They were looking at the construction crew with an attention that was unmistakable and that conveyed, in Schneider's description, absolutely nothing that a human observer could reliably interpret as either hostile or benign. It was an attention that was simply total and completely opaque. What happened next happened very fast. Schneider could not, in his lectures, reconstruct the precise sequence of events with the confidence he would have liked, because the events moved at a speed and with a violence that compressed his memory of them into a sequence of impressions rather than a coherent narrative. There was a sound. There was movement. There was a confrontation between the entities and the construction crew and the military security personnel who were part of the installation's operating structure. There were weapons. Human weapons on one side and something that was not a conventional weapon on the other side. A directed energy discharge of some kind that Schneider described as producing a beam of blue-violet light that was hot in a way that was not quite the same as the heat of fire. He was struck by this discharge. He showed the audience the evidence, the hand with the missing fingers, the scars on his chest. He did not describe his injuries with any pleasure. He described them with the matter-of-fact directness of a man cataloguing damage that he had accepted and moved on from as well as he was able. By his account, 66 American military and construction personnel died in the incident. By his account, he was one of 3 survivors. By his account, the incident was classified at a level that made most top-secret clearances look like visitor badges under the administrative cover of the Department of Energy, which had jurisdiction over nuclear facilities and underground programs in ways that kept them insulated from the more conventional oversight mechanisms of the Department of Defense. By his account, the classification was not merely a matter of marking documents with the right stamps. It was a matter of the surviving witnesses receiving the kind of counselling, a word he used with deliberate irony, that ensured their ongoing silence, and of the families of those who died receiving the kind of explanation that was not an explanation but was accompanied by benefits, and a plausibility that made further questioning feel both pointless and dangerous. There is no official documentation of the 1979 Dulce War, no casualty records, no after-action reports, no Department of Energy communications that acknowledge the event. The absence of documentation is the wall that every serious researcher who has examined this story eventually arrives at, and what you make of that wall depends entirely on what you already believe about the capacity of the American national security apparatus to classify and suppress events that it does not wish the public to know about. That capacity is not hypothetical, it is historical fact. The United States government has classified and suppressed events of significant scale and consequence throughout the history of the national security state. Events that remain genuinely unknown to the public for decades before they eventually surface through declassification, through whistleblowers, through the slow erosion of institutional silence that time always produces. The MKUltra program, the human radiation experiments of the Atomic Energy Commission, the COINTELPRO operations against American civil rights organizations, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. These are not conspiracy theories, they are documented history. The classification and suppression of each of them was, at the time, considered internally justified by the agencies that conducted and concealed them. The people within those agencies who knew about them and said nothing were not, in most cases, monsters. They were professionals who had been trained in a culture of institutional silence and who applied that training to events that, had they been known publicly, would have generated consequences that the institutions wished to avoid. If the Dulce War occurred, if 66 people died in a tunnel beneath a mesa in northern New Mexico in August of 1979 during confrontation with non-human entities in a classified facility that no official document acknowledges exists, then its suppression would have required a classification effort that was aggressive, but not categorically different from suppression efforts that are known to have occurred in other contexts. More extreme in its subject matter, yes, but not more extreme in its institutional mechanisms. Philip Schneider began speaking publicly about his experiences in May of 1995. He gave approximately 30 lectures in the following 8 months, in locations across the Pacific Northwest and the broader American West, to audiences that range from small gatherings of dedicated UFO researchers to larger public presentations that drew people who had no particular prior interest in the subject, and who left, by the accounts of those who attended, with a significantly different relationship to the question of what their government might be doing without their knowledge. He was frightened when he spoke, not performatively frightened, not the theatrical fear of a man playing a role, but frightened in the specific and calibrated way of a person who has identified a specific and credible threat, and is responding to it with the last tool available to them, public exposure. He told his audiences that he had already survived, by his count, 13 assassination attempts since he had begun his public speaking. He told them that he had been contacted by people who made it clear that his continued public disclosure was being monitored by parties with the means and the demonstrated willingness to end it. He told them that he knew he was going to die, and that he wanted to die having said publicly what he knew, so that when it happened the people who were listening would understand what it meant. On January 17th, 1996, Philip Schneider was found dead in his apartment in Wilsonville, Oregon. He had been dead for approximately a week. The Clackamas County medical examiner, upon examination of the body and the scene, ruled the cause of death as suicide by self-strangulation. The method is worth pausing on. Self-strangulation, the compression of the carotid arteries or the trachea through force, applied by the person themselves, is one of the rarest methods of suicide documented in forensic literature. The reason is physiological. As consciousness begins to fail from oxygen deprivation, the muscle control necessary to maintain the compressive force dissipates, and the compression releases before death occurs. Completing a self-strangulation requires either a mechanical assist, a ligature attached to a fixed point, for example, which allows gravity to maintain the compressive force after voluntary muscular control is lost, or a level of sustained voluntary effort that is, in the clinical literature, essentially without precedent. The physical evidence at the scene, as described by Schneider's former wife Cynthia Schneider, who conducted her own investigation after the ruling was made, included a rubber catheter tube found around her former husband's neck. A catheter tube. Not a rope, not a cord, not a ligature of any description that is normally associated with fatal self-strangulation. A rubber catheter tube, which is a medical instrument, flexible and somewhat elastic, not the kind of material that a person planning to end their own life selects from among the options available to them. His medications were gone. He required several significant medications for health conditions that were documented and severe, and those medications were not in the apartment when the scene was processed. His papers, the notes, the documents, the accumulated research of years spent building the evidentiary foundation for his public claims, were not in the apartment. His government-issued safety deposit box, which he had told people contained his most sensitive materials, and which he had specifically described as containing documentation he intended to use in future lectures, had been emptied. Not cleaned out in the ordinary sense of a person settling their affairs. Emptied. Between the last time Schneider had been seen accessing it and the discovery of his death, someone had removed its contents. The suicide ruling stands in the official record. No investigation expanded to examine the questions raised by the missing medications, the missing papers, the missing safety deposit box contents. Philip Schneider was dead, and the official determination was that he had killed himself, and the institutions that might have been expected to take an interest in the anomalies surrounding that determination chose not to. The amplification of the Dulce story that followed Schneider's death was partly a function of the story itself. He had been saying, publicly and repeatedly, that he was going to be killed for what he knew, and then he died under suspicious circumstances, and the logical inference that even sceptical observers had to at least consider was more than sufficient to sustain continued interest. But it was also a function of the other voices that had been adding to the narrative in the years before and after Schneider's death. Voices that gave the story a breadth and a density of allegation that made it impossible to dismiss as the product of a single unstable mind. John Lear was among the most significant of those voices, and he was among the most difficult to dismiss on the grounds of credibility. His father, William Lear, had been the founder of the Lear Jet Corporation, and one of the more consequential aviation entrepreneurs of the 20th century, a man whose technical innovations had shaped the industry. John Lear had grown up in that world and had built a career within it that was, by any conventional measure, impressive. Commercial pilot ratings across more than 100 different aircraft types, including some of the most demanding platforms in civilian and military aviation. Contracts with the CIA for flight operations in Southeast Asia, during the period when the agency was conducting activities in that region that were both extensive and not publicly acknowledged. A professional profile that gave him genuine access to the institutional culture of classified government operations and genuine credibility as a person who understood how that culture functioned. When Lear began making public statements in the late 1980s about what he claimed to know regarding the government's relationship with extraterrestrial entities, the statements were received with a seriousness that the same claims from a less credentialed source would not have received. He described the alleged 1954 treaty not as an equitable agreement between parties with broadly comparable interests, but as a fundamentally lopsided arrangement that had spiralled significantly beyond whatever the government had originally agreed to. The abduction provisions of the alleged treaty, he claimed, had been presented to Eisenhower's advisers as involving a small number of individuals, hundreds, perhaps, per year, selected non-randomly, with records kept and shared with the government, and with the individuals returned after examination without permanent harm. By the 1980s, according to Lear's account, the reality bore no resemblance to these terms. The numbers were not hundreds per year. The selection was not governed by any protocol that the government had agreed to or could monitor, and the return provision was not being honoured in any consistent way. The government's response to this situation in Lear's account was not confrontation. It was not a renegotiation of terms from a position of moral authority. It was accommodation, because the alternative to accommodation, open acknowledgement of what had been agreed to and what the agreement had produced, was a political and social catastrophe that no administration had been willing to contemplate. The cover-up was not, in this framework, a cover-up of something that had happened and been resolved. It was a cover-up of something that was ongoing, that was producing ongoing harm, and that the government was continuing to conceal, not because the situation had been managed, but because managing it was not something that anyone in the chain of institutional authority had figured out how to do. Lear's account introduced another element that would become a persistent thread in subsequent Dulce research. The suggestion that the underground installation near Dulce was not an isolated facility, but a node in a network of deep underground military bases, DUMBs in the acronym that researchers adopted, that extended across the continental United States in a system of tunnels and installations that constituted, if the accounts were accurate, the largest construction program in American history, conducted entirely in secret, without any public appropriation or oversight, funded through mechanisms that the conspiracy research community identified as including classified budget lines, drug trafficking proceeds, and the financial structures of intelligence community front organizations. The most famous node in this alleged network, beyond Dulce itself, was the complex beneath Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, which was publicly known as the home of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and which the conspiracy framework positioned as the command and control hub of the DUM network. But the network allegedly extended far beyond Cheyenne Mountain and Dulce, to installations beneath the Nevada test site, beneath Fort Huachuca in Arizona, beneath Dulles Airport in Virginia, beneath the Denver International Airport, an institution that has generated its own extensive mythology in connection with underground facilities and whose official construction history contains anomalies that researchers have found worth examining. The tunnel connections between these alleged installations are described in the more detailed accounts as being the product of tunnel boring technology, significantly in advance of anything available in the public domain. Machines capable of boring tunnels of substantial diameter through solid rock, at speeds that would have required years of conventional construction to accomplish in weeks, using methods that either melted the surrounding rock into a glassy lining as they advanced. A process called nuclear subterranean tunneling, which was actually researched under that name at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in the 1973 through 1975 period, producing patents that are publicly accessible, or employed the directed application of energy to fracture and remove rock in ways that conventional TBM technology could not match. The public record of nuclear subterranean research at Los Alamos is real. The patents are real. The technical papers describing the underlying principles are publicly available. What is not public, what remains classified or simply absent from the public record, is any evidence that the technology was deployed operationally at scale to build the tunnel network that the conspiracy framework describes. The gap between a research program that produced patents and a deployed operational system that built thousands of miles of high-speed underground transport tunnels is significant, and the evidence for what happened in that gap is, by the nature of the classification that allegedly surrounds it, essentially unavailable to independent researchers. The satellite and electromagnetic research of the 2000s and 2010s added new data layers to the Dulce story without resolving its fundamental questions. Researchers with access to commercial satellite imagery platforms, imagery that, by the early 2000s, had achieved a resolution that earlier generations of civilian researchers could not have imagined, began systematic analysis of the Archuleta Mesa area and its surroundings. The thermal imaging analysis produced heat signature maps of the mesa's surface that showed patterns the researchers found inconsistent with the known geothermal and biological activity of the region. Specific areas of the mesa showed elevated surface temperatures that were consistent in their spatial distribution and their temporal persistence, with heat being conducted upward from underground sources. The magnitude of the elevation was not enormous, not the kind of signature that a nuclear reactor venting heat directly to the surface would produce, but it was consistent across multiple imaging sessions conducted in different seasons and different weather conditions, and it was spatially patterned in ways that correlated with the reported layout of the underground installation. The electromagnetic anomaly research was conducted by a range of individuals with varying levels of technical expertise, from credentialed electrical engineers conducting systematic surveys to amateur radio operators tracking frequency anomalies in their home reception. The most technically rigorous of these investigations documented a recurring anomaly in the electromagnetic environment of the Dulce area. Low-frequency signals with characteristics that did not match any known natural source and that did not correspond to any publicly allocated frequency use in the relevant spectrum. The modulation characteristics of these signals, the way they varied over time, were consistent with carrier wave communications rather than natural electromagnetic phenomena, suggesting that whatever was generating them was doing so for informational purposes. The signals could not be decoded by any method available to the researchers who detected them, but they could be tracked, and over time, the tracking produced the temporal correlation that several researchers documented with increasing confidence. The strongest signal events were clustered in temporal proximity to the periods of most intense regional cattle mutilation activity. The correlation does not prove causation. We want to be precise about that. But the correlation is real, and it is documented, and it is the kind of correlation that, in any other investigative context, would be considered a significant lead worthy of serious follow-up investigation. The serious follow-up investigation has not occurred, for the same reason that the serious investigation of Gabe Valdez's evidence did not occur. The institutional interest in examining the question does not exist, and without institutional interest the resources and access necessary for rigorous investigation are unavailable. Missing persons research in connection with the Dulce area has been conducted by a number of researchers over the decades, and it is among the most ethically fraught components of the entire investigation because it involves real people who really disappeared and whose families are real and whose suffering is real regardless of what ultimately explains the disappearances. We will treat this dimension of the story with the care it requires, the pattern that researchers have documented, and it is a documented pattern in the sense that the underlying data points are real, even if the pattern they allegedly form is subject to interpretive dispute, involves the geographic clustering of missing persons reports, cattle mutilation incidents, and UFO sighting reports in the region surrounding Dulce. The cluster analysis that several researchers have conducted shows a spatial concentration of all three phenomena in a radius centered on the Archuleta Mesa area that exceeds what random distribution of the underlying events would be expected to produce. The concentration is most pronounced for the periods of highest cattle mutilation activity, the mid-1970s through early 1980s, but it persists at a lower intensity in subsequent decades. The researchers who have examined this pattern are careful, in the more responsible accounts, not to assert that all or most of the missing persons cases are connected to the alleged underground installation. People disappear in rural areas for many reasons, and the statistical challenge of separating a genuine signal from a noisy dataset without controlled methodology is significant. What they assert is more modest, that the pattern is real, that it warrants investigation, and that the investigation has not occurred, that the families of people who disappeared in the Dulce area during the periods of highest anomalous activity have not, in most cases, received explanations that satisfy them, and that institutional agencies responsible for investigating disappearances have not, in those cases, conducted investigations of the depth and diligence that the families had reason to expect. The connection between the alleged biological research program at the Dulce installation and the legitimate genetic research programs at Los Alamos and Sandia is one of the more structurally interesting threads in the conspiracy framework, because it operates not through the kind of direct causal claim that can be straightforwardly evaluated, but through an architectural argument about institutional proximity and personnel overlap. Los Alamos National Laboratory's publicly acknowledged research portfolio in the 1970s and 1980s included, alongside its primary mission in nuclear weapons, a growing program in what the institution called biological research, molecular biology, genetics, biomedical applications of radiation technology. This was not hidden. It was published. But the specific nature of some of this research and the specific techniques employed remained classified in ways that the institution justified on national security grounds without specifying the nature of the security concern. The conspiracy argument does not suggest that Los Alamos scientists were conducting hybrid experiments in their public laboratory. It suggests something more architecturally subtle, that the personnel pipelines between Los Alamos and the alleged Dulce installation ran in both directions, that researchers who had demonstrated specific expertise in genetic techniques within the public program were identified as candidates for classified work that used those techniques in ways that the public program was not permitted to pursue, and that the institutional culture of Los Alamos, with its decades of practice at keeping secrets at the highest classification levels, provided the human infrastructure for a program that went far beyond anything the institution could publicly acknowledge. The timeline is suggestive in ways that researchers have found difficult to ignore. The most technically sophisticated hybridization experiments alleged to have occurred at the Dulce installation are said to have taken place in the early to mid-1980s. The public scientific community achieved the first successful demonstrations of recombinant DNA technology in the mid-1970s, and the first human gene was cloned in 1977. The pace of public genetic research in the early 1980s was extraordinary by the standards of the scientific community, but it was still orders of magnitude behind what the Dulce accounts describe as having been achieved within the classified program by the same period. The gap between the public timeline and the alleged classified timeline is either evidence that the classified program had access to technologies and insights that the public scientific community did not, which is what the treaty framework alleges, or it is evidence that the classified timeline is fabricated. There is no position from which that question can currently be answered with certainty. The document that surfaced in the 2020 era, circulating in the more dedicated corners of the UFO and Dulce research community, has been described above. We will add some detail here. The document is formatted in a style consistent with classified government memoranda of the relevant period. A specific header structure, a classification marking system, a distribution list that uses alphanumeric designations rather than agency names. The language is the language of bureaucratic understatement, the flat, affectless prose in which classified government communications discuss the most extraordinary subjects as though they were procurement decisions or administrative updates. The document refers to a subsurface facility in northern New Mexico in terms that treat its existence as an established fact, requiring no explanation or justification, only administrative attention. It refers to the non-human occupants of the facility in a single sentence that describes them as a party to an agreement in the specific legalistic sense of a party to a contract, which implies a negotiated relationship rather than either a captive or an equal participant relationship. And it notes, in the final substantive paragraph, that the joint occupancy agreement governing the facility has been renewed. Renewed, not initiated, not re-established after a lapse. Renewed. The language of continuity. The language of a relationship that has been ongoing long enough to require periodic administrative renewal rather than periodic justification for its existence. The language of something that has become, in the context of the institution that produced the document, simply part of the ongoing operational landscape, a management matter rather than a policy decision. The document may be genuine. The document may be a sophisticated fabrication. We cannot determine which. What we can note is that its language, its format, and its specific bureaucratic register are all consistent with the kind of institutional communication that the described facility, if it exists, would generate, and that the question of its authenticity is one that the relevant institutions have neither confirmed nor denied, because their consistent position is that there is nothing to confirm or deny. We come finally to the mesa itself. We come to the experience of standing on the surface of the thing, of placing your feet on rock that has been in this place for longer than the human species has existed, and that may, if a fraction of what is alleged about it is true, be concealing something that changes everything we believe about our place in the universe and the nature of the world we inhabit. Imagine it. Late afternoon on a day in early autumn, when the high desert light is doing what it always does at that hour and that season, turning every surface it touches into something that glows from within, amber and gold and a deep reddish brown that makes the rock look like it is retaining the summer for one last afternoon before releasing it to the coming cold. You have driven the roads that are accessible, walked the distance from the last point where a vehicle can go, climbed the lowest slopes of the mesa through juniper and piñons that thin out as the elevation increases and the soil becomes too shallow and too rocky for deep root systems. You have your equipment, a compass, a Geiger counter, a sensitive magnetometer, a recorder for your notes and observations. You have your research, 50 years of it, gathered from the accounts of people who came before you and from the documented evidence that no official investigation has adequately addressed, and from the deep personal conviction that things that have been kept hidden deserve the effort of people willing to look. The mesa's surface at the higher elevations is a landscape of weathered rock and sparse vegetation, beautiful in the specific way that high desert landscapes are beautiful, austere, honest, requiring no softness to be striking. The silence here is the particular silence of high elevation and remoteness, a silence with genuine depth, the kind that takes several minutes to fully sink into consciousness as you move from the noise of the road into the stillness of the open land. But there is something else in the silence, something that does not quite belong to it, a low-frequency vibration that is below the threshold of hearing but not below the threshold of physical perception, a quality in the rock beneath your boots that suggests, not loudly, not with any certainty that would satisfy a skeptic, that the rock is not simply sitting there in the passive stability of geological matter, but is transmitting something, conducting something from below. The vibration is not consistent. It pulses, not rapidly, not with any rhythm that the human ear would recognize as musical or mechanical, but with a slow, deep periodicity that seems, as you track it over time, to be related to something below rather than around you. The compass needle does not point north. It points northeast consistently by approximately 15 degrees of deviation from the expected bearing, and the deviation does not change as you move across the surface of the mesa, which means it is not a local magnetic anomaly produced by a specific surface feature, but something that is generating a consistent magnetic influence over a wide area from a source whose depth and character you cannot determine with the equipment you have. The magnetometer confirms the anomaly and adds detail. The field is not static. It oscillates at a frequency that the instrument can measure, but that you cannot source to any natural magnetic phenomenon you're aware of that would produce this specific combination of magnitude, consistency, and oscillatory frequency at this location. The Geiger counter ticks at a rate that is elevated above the background level expected at this elevation and in this geological context. Not dramatically elevated, not the kind of reading that would indicate acute exposure to a radiation source, but elevated in a way that is consistent with radioactive material at depth, the kind of reading that the rock above a nuclear-powered underground installation might produce as a function of the slow upward diffusion of radiogenic gases through the overlying geology. The sky above the mesa in the late afternoon and early evening of a clear autumn day is extraordinary. The altitude and the remoteness from artificial light sources combine to produce a clarity and a depth of field that renders the visible stars as they begin to emerge as genuine objects at genuine distances rather than the flat printed quality they have when seen through the atmospheric haze and light pollution of populated areas. You can see the structure of the galaxy. You can see with the naked eye objects that human beings did not know existed before the invention of the telescope. The sky is not a backdrop. It is a volume of space that extends in every direction and contains things that are real and specific and present. And the awareness of this, the awareness that you are standing on a planet in a galaxy, in a universe that is incomprehensibly large and that has been producing the conditions for life and intelligence for billions of years, is something that the specific context of this place renders immediate and impossible to push back into the comfortable abstraction where most of us keep it most of the time. And then, in the darkness above the northern ridge of the mesa, there is a light. Not a star. Stars are fixed and constant and do not pulse with the slow, deliberate periodicity that this light displays. Not an aircraft. Aircraft carry navigation lights that flash in regulated patterns and move across the sky in trajectories that reflect the physics of flight. This light is stationary. This light pulses once every several seconds, with a regularity that suggests intention rather than natural phenomenon, and it is positioned above the ridge at an angle and an altitude that would place its source, if it were on the ground rather than in the air, at a specific point on the mesa's upper surface that correlates, according to the research you have done, with one of the areas where thermal imaging has shown elevated temperature signatures. The light disappears. The silence returns, or rather what was always the silence returns, because the silence never actually left. It was always there beneath the vibration and the magnetic anomaly and the elevated radiation count and the unexplained light, the profound and ancient quiet of a place that has been in this form for 200 million years and will be in some form for 200 million more, regardless of what has been built within it and what agreements have been renewed in the offices of institutions whose names do not appear in public records. You stand on the rock. The ground hums beneath your feet with the patient persistence of something that has been humming for decades, something that does not need you to acknowledge it because it was never conducting its operations for your benefit. The compass needle holds its 15-degree deviation without apology. The Geiger counter ticks. The stars continue to emerge in numbers that remind you of your scale, and you understand, standing here, that the question you came to ask is not going to be answered tonight, is not going to be answered by standing on a mesa in the dark with consumer-grade instruments and 50 years of other people's research filed in your mind. The answer, if it exists, is below you. It is behind whatever barrier has been placed between the surface world and the operations that the evidence suggests are being conducted beneath it. It is in the files that do not appear in FOIA requests, and the documents that have been removed from evidence chains, and the papers that were missing from a dead man's apartment, and the safety deposit box that was emptied before anyone could examine its contents. But standing here, with the vibration in your feet and the light gone now from the ridge and the silence of the high desert, holding everything in its deep, old, knowing quiet, you understand something that the files and the research and the testimony of the dead and the living does not quite convey in the abstracted form of written accounts. You understand it physically. You feel it in the rock beneath your boots. Whatever is beneath Archuleta Mesa is still there. It has always been there. It was there before Gabe Valdez documented his first mutilation. It was there before the drilling equipment appeared and disappeared in the mid-1970s. It was there when Philip Schneider broke through the rock face and found what was waiting on the other side. It was there through the decades of investigation and the deaths and the suppression and the accumulated weight of half a century of questions that no official body has ever genuinely tried to answer. It is there now, and the document, genuine or fabricated, that circulates in the research community with the language of administrative continuity, joint occupancy agreement renewed, suggests that it will be there, under whatever new terms the renewal entails, for the foreseeable future. The question is not whether it is there. The question is what it wants. And the deeper question, the question that the treaty framework raises and does not answer, is whether what it wants and what we agree to give it are still the same thing, or whether in the decades since the agreement was first made, the terms have shifted in ways that we are not in a position to renegotiate. The night deepens, the stars multiply, the ground hums, and somewhere below, in the dark and the depth and the silence of a place that has no name in any public document and no location on any map that civilians are permitted to see, something continues to happen. Something that began before most of the people alive today were born. Something that has outlasted administrations and treaties and the careers and lives of the people who built it, and the people who investigated it, and the people who died trying to tell what they found. Something that is, in the flat bureaucratic language of a memorandum whose provenance cannot be established, but whose language carries the specific gravity of institutional truth, still operational. The mesa holds its silence. The stars hold their positions. The compass needle holds its deviation. The Eye of Atlantis. Secrets beneath the Sahara. Before we begin, I want to thank our Win, eventually, for suggesting this incredible topic. Your curiosity drives us to explore the mysteries that history has buried, and today's story is one that will challenge everything you thought you knew about human civilization. Imagine standing at the edge of infinity. The sun beats down on endless dunes that stretch to every horizon. Waves of sand frozen in time. You're in one of the most remote places on Earth, the Western Sahara of Mauritania, where few humans venture and even fewer return unchanged. But you're not here for the desert. You're here for something that should not exist. Something so massive, so perfectly formed, that it can only truly be seen from space itself. From orbit, astronauts have called it the most remarkable feature in Africa. Geologists call it an anomaly. Ancient theorists call it proof. The locals who live in its shadow call it cursed. But to those who dare to connect the dots between myth and reality, it has another name entirely. They call it Atlantis. This is the story of the Rishi structure, a formation so immense and so geometrically precise that it defies every explanation we have been given. This is the story of how a philosopher's legend became an archaeological obsession, how satellite imagery revealed what ground expeditions could not find, and how the greatest mystery of the ancient world might be hiding not beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean, but beneath an ocean of sand. What you're about to hear will make you question the timeline of human history. It will make you wonder what else has been buried, redacted, or simply forgotten. Because in the heart of the Sahara lies a perfect circle, and within that circle may lie the answer to humanity's oldest question. Where did we really come from? The discovery. The year was 1965. Astronaut James McDivitt was aboard Gemini 4, orbiting Earth at speeds that would make the mind reel. He was supposed to be focused on his mission parameters, on the technical readings and trajectory calculations that kept him alive in the vacuum of space. But something caught his eye through the small window of his capsule, something down on the surface of northwest Africa that made him reach for the camera. What he photographed that day would haunt researchers for generations. It appeared as a perfect bullseye in the desert, concentric circles of rock radiating outward from a central point with mathematical precision. The formation was enormous, stretching approximately 25 miles across, visible only because of the altitude and angle of his spacecraft. From the ground it would be impossible to see. From orbit it was unmistakable. The photograph was filed with thousands of others from the Gemini program, labelled and archived. But it kept appearing in subsequent missions. Apollo astronauts saw it. Shuttle crews saw it. Every single orbital mission that passed over Mauritania captured the same haunting image. A perfect eye staring up from the Sahara. The scientific community took notice. In the early 1970s, the Geological Survey of Mauritania conducted the first detailed mapping expedition to the site. What they found both explained and deepened the mystery. The formation consisted of 3 distinct concentric rings, each composed of different rock types. The outer ring was limestone, ancient and weathered. The middle ring was quartzite, harder and more resistant to erosion. The inner ring contained rhyolite, a volcanic rock that suggested deep geological forces at work. They named it the Risha structure, after the small desert town of Wudan that sat near its perimeter. The official explanation was presented with confidence. This was an eroded geological dome, created by the uplift of rock layers over hundreds of millions of years, then slowly worn down by wind and rare desert rains into this circular pattern. Case closed, they said. Natural formation. Nothing more to see. But there was a problem with that explanation. A problem that would not go away no matter how many times the scientific establishment repeated their conclusions. The symmetry was too perfect. The spacing between rings was too regular. The ratios were too precise. Natural erosion is chaotic, random, asymmetrical. Rivers carve irregular paths. Wind creates jagged formations. Time does not draw with a compass. Yet here, in the middle of nowhere, was a structure that looked exactly as if someone had used a compass the size of a mountain range to draw 3 perfect circles in the earth itself. The measurements were even more troubling. When surveyed with precision instruments, the rings showed spacing ratios that appeared intentional. The distances between them followed patterns that seemed almost mathematical, and the entire structure was oriented with geographic precision that natural forces do not typically produce. Geologists publish papers explaining the dome theory. They showed diagrams of how uplifted rock could erode into circular patterns under specific conditions. They pointed to other geological domes around the world as comparison. But none of those other formations looked anything like the Richat structure. None had the perfect symmetry. None had the precise spacing. None looked like they had been designed. And then someone remembered Plato. Plato's blueprint. In 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote 2 dialogues that would become the most famous unsolved mystery in human history. In Timaeus and Critias, he described a legendary island civilization called Atlantis, a place of advanced technology and culture that was destroyed in a single day and night of catastrophic floods. For over 2,000 years, explorers and historians searched for Atlantis. They looked in the Mediterranean Sea, in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the Caribbean, in Antarctica, in dozens of locations around the globe. Every generation had a new theory, a new location, a new explanation for where this legendary civilization might have existed. But every theory had the same problem. None of them matched Plato's actual description, because Plato had not been vague. He had been remarkably specific. He described Atlantis as a circular island consisting of concentric rings of land and water. He gave precise measurements for these rings. He described mountains to the north and open plains to the south. He mentioned that the civilization had access to a rare red, black and white stone. He explained that the city was positioned near a coastal plain that opened to the sea. Historians had always assumed these details were fictional embellishments, the kind of creative additions that storytellers make to give their tales authenticity. After all, Plato was writing about events that supposedly occurred over 9,000 years before his time. How could he possibly know such specific details? But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, independent researchers began comparing Plato's descriptions to the Rishat structure. And what they found was extraordinary. Plato had described the outer ring of Atlantis as being approximately 127 stadia in diameter. A stadia was an ancient Greek unit of measurement roughly equivalent to 185 meters. When you convert Plato's measurements to modern units, the outer ring of Atlantis should be approximately 23.5 kilometers across. The outer ring of the Risha structure measures approximately 23 kilometers in diameter. Plato described the spacing between the rings in specific ratios. The second ring was supposed to be smaller by a precise proportion, and the inner ring smaller still. When researchers measured the Richat structure, the ratios matched within margins that seemed impossible to attribute to coincidence. Plato mentioned that Atlantis had mountains to the north. The Richat structure sits at the base of a highland region to its north. Plato said the civilization faced south toward the sea. In ancient times, before the Sahara became desert, a vast network of rivers and lakes extended south from the Richat region toward what would have been a much larger ancient shoreline. Plato described 3 types of stone used in Atlantean construction: red, black, and white. The Richat structure contains red rhyolite, black volcanic breccia, and white limestone, all present in the geological layers of the site. One by one, the correspondences stacked up. Every detail that Plato had provided matched the Richat structure in ways that no other proposed location for Atlantis had ever matched. It was as if Plato had been describing this exact place, this exact formation, with a precision that should have been impossible for someone writing 2,000 years before satellite photography. The implications were staggering. If Plato had been accurate about the physical description, could he have been accurate about the rest? Could there truly have been an advanced civilization at the Richat structure, a civilization that existed before the desert consumed it? To answer that question, researchers had to answer another one first. Could the Sahara have ever supported such a civilization at all? The Green Sahara. When you picture the Sahara Desert today, you imagine the largest hot desert on Earth, a realm of endless dunes and scorching heat, where nothing can survive. But the Sahara has not always been a desert, and the proof of that lies written in the rocks, the fossils, and the satellite images that reveal what the sand has tried to hide. Between approximately 12,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. Climate scientists call this period the African Humid Period, a time when the Earth's axial tilt and orbital patterns created different weather systems across North Africa. Instead of the bone-dry wasteland we know today, the region was filled with rivers, lakes, forests, and grasslands. Satellite studies conducted by NASA and the University of Arizona using synthetic aperture radar have revealed vast networks of ancient riverbeds beneath the sand. These were not small streams, but major river systems comparable to the Nile, flowing from the interior highlands toward ancient lake basins. One of these river networks passed directly through the region where the Richat structure sits. The fossil record confirms what the radar images suggest. Archaeologists and paleontologists have discovered bones of crocodiles, elephants, hippos, and giraffes scattered throughout the Sahara, including in areas very close to the Richat structure. These are not desert animals. They're creatures that require abundant water and vegetation. Their presence proves that the Sahara once sustained rich ecosystems. Rock art found in caves throughout Mauritania and the broader Sahara shows ancient peoples hunting and herding in landscapes filled with wildlife and water. These paintings, some dating back over 10,000 years, depict scenes that would be unimaginable in the current desert. Cattle grazing, people swimming, lush vegetation everywhere. Local Berber and Tuareg oral traditions contain stories passed down through countless generations about cities that once existed in regions now covered by sand. They speak of a time when their ancestors lived in places of great abundance, before the rains failed and the desert consumed everything. They describe ruins beneath the dunes, places where the sand sometimes shifts to reveal ancient walls and forgotten structures. For decades, Western academics dismissed these stories as mythology, the kind of exaggerated tales that every culture tells about a golden age in the distant past. But as satellite technology improved and as archaeological evidence accumulated, researchers began to realize these oral traditions might contain fragments of actual historical memory. If the Sahara was green and fertile during the African Humid Period, if it supported complex ecosystems and human populations, then a major civilization could have existed there. and if such a civilization had been centred at the Risha structure during that verdant age, it would have had access to everything it needed: water from rivers and lakes, stone from the geological formation itself, a commanding view of the surrounding landscape, and a location that would have been near ancient coastlines or major waterways. But then something happened. Around 5,000 years ago, the climate shifted. The rain stopped. The rivers dried up. The lakes evaporated. The green Sahara died, and the desert we know today was born. Any civilization that had existed in the interior Sahara would have faced a catastrophic collapse. Not from floods washing their cities into the sea, as Plato had described, but from the opposite, from water disappearing entirely, from fertile lands becoming barren, from the life-giving rivers turning to dust. Could Plato's story of Atlantis being destroyed by water have been a garbled version of the truth? Could the ancient tale have been about a civilization that died not because water came, but because water left? Could the flood that destroyed Atlantis have been a flood of sand instead? The evidence beneath the surface. When you look at satellite imagery of the Rishi structure with fresh eyes, with the possibility that it might be more than just geology, patterns begin to emerge that the official explanations cannot quite account for. The circular ridges that form the famous rings are not uniform in their erosion. In several places they show what appear to be breaches or gaps at regular intervals, as if something other than random weathering created passages through them. These gaps align with what would be expected if the rings had once been reinforced walls with deliberate entry points. Radial patterns extend outward from the inner rings like spokes on a wheel. Erosion alone rarely creates such geometric regularity. But if the ancient inhabitants had built causeways or roads radiating from a central administrative area outward to the peripheral zones, this is exactly the pattern we might expect to find after thousands of years of degradation. The most intriguing evidence comes from analysis of the rock itself. Samples taken from the outer ring areas contain traces of petrified marine organisms, shells and fossilized remnants of sea life that confirm this region was once under or adjacent to water. While this supports the Green Sahara theory, it also raises questions about what else might be preserved in those stone layers. Independent exploration teams who have visited the site report finding tool fragments and stone artifacts in the wadis and depressions around the structure. Some of these artifacts have been carbon dated to over 10,000 years ago, placing them squarely within the time frame when Atlantis was supposed to have existed according to Plato's chronology. Critics immediately point out that finding ancient stone tools in the Sahara is not unusual. Humans have lived in North Africa for hundreds of thousands of years, and stone tools are common throughout the region. These artifacts, they argue, have nothing to do with the Risha structure specifically, and certainly do not prove the existence of an advanced civilization. But proponents counter that the consistency and concentration of findings around the Risha area suggest something more than random hunter-gatherer presence. They point to the types of tools discovered, some of which show sophisticated manufacturing techniques. They note the presence of what appear to be worked stones too large to be simple tools, blocks that might have been part of construction projects. The debate intensifies when discussing what lies beneath the surface. Ground-penetrating radar studies conducted by independent researchers have detected unusual subsurface anomalies within the Rishat structure. Dense strata with geometric patterns, possible void spaces that could indicate chambers or tunnels, symmetrical underground formations that do not fit standard geological models. These findings have not been peer-reviewed or officially published, which mainstream scientists cite as proof of their unreliability. But the researchers who conducted these studies claim they have been unable to get their work published, precisely because it challenges accepted theories. They describe a pattern of journals rejecting their papers without proper review, of academic conferences declining their presentations, of institutional barriers that prevent serious examination of non-mainstream theories about the site. Every piece of evidence that might support the Atlantis theory is met with skepticism and alternative explanations. Every anomaly is dismissed as misinterpretation or equipment error. Every correspondence between the Risha structure and Plato's description is labelled coincidence. And yet the evidence keeps accumulating. The patterns keep appearing. The questions keep demanding answers that the official explanations cannot quite provide. Which brings us to perhaps the most damning evidence of all, the evidence that someone does not want this site investigated too closely. The wall of silence. If the Riche structure is just an eroded geological dome with no archaeological significance, then researching it should be straightforward. Submit a proposal, get a permit, conduct excavations, publish findings. This is how archaeology works at sites around the world. But the Risha structure is different. Multiple research teams have applied for permits to conduct archaeological excavations within the formation. They have submitted detailed proposals outlining non-invasive survey methods, careful excavation protocols, and collaborative frameworks with local authorities. These applications have been denied repeatedly by Mauritanian government officials, often without clear explanation. The official reasons given vary. Sometimes the authorities cite heritage protection concerns, arguing that the site must be preserved from potential damage. Sometimes they mention environmental sensitivity, claiming that research activity might disrupt the desert ecosystem. Sometimes they simply say the area is closed to archaeological investigation, without providing any justification at all. UNESCO has listed the Risha structure in its World Heritage Tentative List, acknowledging the site's potential significance. But this listing has not led to increased access for researchers. Instead, the area remains classified as environmentally sensitive with strict limitations on who can work there and what methods they can employ. Researchers who have tried to work in the region describe a pattern of obstruction. Local officials who initially express interest in supporting expeditions suddenly become unreachable. Equipment shipments get held up in customs indefinitely. Required permissions get delayed month after month until research seasons pass and funding windows close. It is never an outright refusal, just an endless series of bureaucratic tangles that make serious investigation effectively impossible. Some Western academics who have expressed interest in Saharan archaeology related to the Risha structure report similar obstacles from their own institutions. Grant proposals get rejected with vague criticisms about methodological concerns. Department heads discourage junior researchers from pursuing these topics, warning that it could harm their careers. Peer reviewers block papers from publication, not because of flawed data, but because of controversial implications. One researcher, speaking anonymously to avoid professional repercussions, described the situation bluntly. When your findings challenge established timelines of civilization, the work simply stops receiving support. They do not say you are wrong. They do not engage with your evidence. They just make it impossible for you to continue. The phrase they use is methodological inconsistency, but everyone knows what it really means. Stop digging. This pattern of obstruction extends even to remote sensing data. Several researchers report that high-resolution satellite imagery they had been using for analysis suddenly became restricted or degraded in quality. Digital elevation maps that showed detailed topography of the Risha structure mysteriously disappeared from open archives. Ground-penetrating radar data that had been collected vanished from institutional databases. When questioned about these missing data sets, authorities offer technical explanations, routine data management, updated privacy protocols, licensing restrictions. But the consistency of the pattern is hard to ignore. Data that might support non-mainstream theories about the site becomes unavailable, while data that supports conventional geological explanations remains readily accessible. The silence extends to the media as well. Major documentaries about ancient mysteries and lost civilizations routinely cover the Atlantis legend, but they rarely spend significant time on the Risha structure despite its remarkable correspondences with Plato's description. When it is mentioned, it is usually dismissed quickly with the standard geological explanation, before moving on to more sensational but less evidentially supported locations. Why would so many institutional barriers exist around a site that is supposedly just an eroded rock formation? If there is nothing there, why prevent serious investigation? If the geological explanation is correct, why not allow research that would conclusively prove it and put the Atlantis theories to rest? The refusal to allow thorough investigation becomes its own form of evidence. The silence screams louder than any artifact could. The global pattern. The story of the Risha structure does not exist in isolation. Around the world, researchers have identified other sites with striking similarities, massive stone constructions of uncertain age, precisely aligned with astronomical or geographic markers, built with techniques that seem impossibly advanced for their supposed time periods. On the Mediterranean island of Malta, prehistoric temples display architectural sophistication that mainstream archaeology struggles to explain. These structures feature precisely cut megalithic blocks, some weighing over 50 tons, fitted together with remarkable precision. Carbon dating places some of these temples over 5,000 years old, making them older than the Egyptian pyramids and contemporary with the Green Sahara period. In Bolivia, the site of Pumapunku contains stone blocks with perfectly smooth surfaces and complex geometric cuts that would challenge modern manufacturing. The blocks show evidence of advanced stoneworking techniques, possibly even machine precision. The ruins include megalithic platforms and structures arranged in geometric patterns. Mainstream dating places the site at around 1,500 years old, but some researchers argue the stonework could be much more ancient, citing evidence of weathering patterns and astronomical alignments. In the Azores, underwater formations off the coast have been identified by some researchers as possibly artificial structures, though this remains highly controversial. Sonar imaging has revealed what appear to be rectangular formations and straight-edge alignments on the sea floor, in patterns that are difficult to attribute to natural geological processes. Advocates of alternative history theories connect these sites through a proposed framework. An ancient maritime civilization that existed during the late Ice Age and early post-glacial period, before conventional timelines placed the rise of complex societies. This civilization, they argue, was centered in regions that are now underwater or desert, regions that were habitable and even thriving during the different climate conditions of that era. The Younger Dryas event provides a potential mechanism for this civilization's destruction. Between approximately 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, Earth experienced a rapid cooling period that disrupted ecosystems worldwide. Sea levels rose as ice sheets melted and reformed in complex patterns. Coastlines changed dramatically. What had been fertile lowlands became ocean floor. What had been verdant landscapes became frozen or dried wastelands. If an advanced civilization had developed during the warmer period before the Younger Dryas, centered in coastal regions and river valleys, the climate catastrophe would have destroyed most traces of their existence. Coastal cities would have been submerged by rising seas. Interior settlements would have been abandoned as water sources disappeared. The survivors would have scattered to regions where they could still find resources, carrying with them fragmentary memories of what had been lost. This theory would explain why so many ancient cultures around the world have flood myths, why they describe lost golden ages, why they speak of advanced ancestors whose knowledge has been forgotten. It would explain the mysterious megalithic sites that seem too sophisticated for their supposed time periods. They might be remnants or echo constructions of that earlier lost civilization. The Risha structure fits perfectly into this framework. Positioned in what was once a green and fertile region, surrounded by rivers and possibly near an ancient inland sea, it would have been an ideal location for a major city during the Green Sahara period. As the climate changed and the desert advanced, the city would have been abandoned, its inhabitants dispersing to other regions, carrying stories of the great circular city they had left behind. Those stories would have travelled through generations, distorted and mythologized over thousands of years, until they reached Plato in ancient Greece as the legend of Atlantis, a great circular city destroyed by catastrophe, remembered in fragments, lost to time. Mainstream archaeology rejects this framework entirely, pointing to lack of physical evidence, problematic dating methods used by alternative researchers, and the tendency of pseudo-archaeology to connect unrelated sites through superficial similarities. They argue that advanced civilizations leave unmistakable traces, monumental construction, widespread artifact distributions, clear evidence of complex social organization. None of this has been found in the Sahara or in supposed Ice Age contexts. But the alternative researchers counter that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when large parts of the potential sites have never been thoroughly investigated. They point to the institutional barriers that prevent such investigation, and they ask why so much resistance exists if there is truly nothing to find. The debate continues, with neither side willing to concede ground, and in the centre of it all, the Risha structure remains, a perfect circle in the sand, waiting for someone to prove what it really is. The conspiracy deepens. In the age of the internet, information spreads in ways that were impossible in previous generations. Amateur researchers, armed with nothing more than freely available satellite imagery and persistent curiosity, began examining the Richer structure with fresh eyes in the early 2000s. What they discovered sparked a wave of conspiracy theories that continue to proliferate across online forums and video platforms. Several researchers noted that certain sections of satellite imagery covering the Richer structure appeared degraded or artificially blurred in ways not consistent with normal image processing. When they compared images from different satellite systems or different time periods, they found inconsistencies that suggested selective editing. High-resolution images that had been available in public databases suddenly became low-resolution, or were removed entirely from access. When questioned, satellite imaging companies and government agencies provided technical explanations, routine quality control, updated privacy standards, licensing restrictions from host countries. But the pattern was suspicious. Why would anyone care about privacy or image quality for a remote desert location with no military or commercial sensitivity? Deeper digging revealed another layer. Declassified intelligence documents from the Cold War era, released through various Freedom of Information requests, contained references to survey operations in Mauritania during the 1950s and 60s. Some of these documents mentioned the Richer structure specifically, noting it as a landmark for navigation and reconnaissance operations. But other documents, heavily redacted, reference something more intriguing. Field stations established near the formation, geological surveys conducted under intelligent oversight, and notations about subsurface anomalies that warranted further investigation. The details were blacked out, but the implications remained visible between the redactions. Why would intelligence agencies have taken interest in a geological formation in the middle of the Sahara Desert? During the Cold War, resources were precious and operations were focused on strategic value. Unless they knew or suspected there was something there worth investigating, something beyond simple geology. The conspiracy theories grew more elaborate. Some researchers claimed that early expeditions to the Richer structure had discovered artifacts or structures that proved advanced ancient civilization, and that these findings had been deliberately suppressed to avoid disrupting established historical narratives. Others suggested that what was found was even more extraordinary, evidence of technology that could not be explained by any known ancient culture, technology that implied outside influence or knowledge far beyond what should have been possible. Online forums buzzed with claims of metallic anomalies buried beneath the structure, of subsurface tunnels that honeycomb the formation, of inscriptions in unknown languages that were photographed and then removed under military escort. None of these claims came with verifiable evidence. No photographs, no documents, no credible first-hand witnesses. Just stories passed from forum to forum, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Skeptics pointed out the obvious. Conspiracy theories thrive in the absence of evidence. When investigation is restricted and information is scarce, speculation fills the void. The lack of proof becomes proof of its own kind in the paranoid logic of conspiracy thinking. Every missing document, every denied permit, every redacted file becomes confirmation that something is being hidden. But even skeptics had to admit that some aspects of the situation were genuinely strange. The satellite image irregularities could be verified by anyone with access to multiple imaging databases. The declassified intelligence documents were real, even if their meaning was unclear. The consistent denial of archaeological permits was documented and unexplained. Perhaps most tellingly, when journalists or documentary makers contacted government officials in Mauritania about the Richet structure and the Atlantis theories, they received responses that seemed oddly defensive. Instead of dismissing the claims with amusement or indifference, officials often reacted with hostility, warning against spreading misinformation or making accusations against the government. Why would bureaucrats care so much about a fringe theory unless there was something they wanted to protect? The conspiracy theories even extended to international organisations. Some researchers claimed that UNESCO and other heritage bodies were deliberately keeping the Richet structure in bureaucratic limbo, neither officially investigating it nor allowing others to do so. This kept the site in a permanent state of uncertainty, preventing any conclusions that might be controversial. Digital suppression became another layer of the conspiracy. Researchers reported that detailed LiDAR scans and ground-penetrating radar data they had collected at the site were mysteriously deleted from cloud storage services or corrupted in ways that made recovery impossible. When they accused tech companies or government agencies of interference, they were told it was random data loss or user error, but too many researchers had the same experience for it to be coincidence. Internet forums began referring to the Richet structure as the most geo-fenced archaeological site on Earth, suggesting that powerful interests were using technology to control information flow about the location. Every time a particularly compelling piece of analysis or evidence appeared online, it would be flagged, disputed, or buried in search rankings until it became effectively invisible. Whether any of this represented real suppression or simply the natural friction between fringe theories and mainstream academia remained impossible to prove. But the perception of conspiracy was undeniable, and in the modern information landscape, perception often matters more than reality. The mystery had taken on a life of its own, independent of whatever truth might exist in the Saharan sand. The revelation that vanished. In recent years, advances in remote sensing technology have given researchers tools that previous generations could only dream of. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, can penetrate vegetation and see ground features invisible to normal observation. Ground-penetrating radar can reveal subsurface structures without disturbing the Earth. These technologies have revolutionized archaeology, discovering lost cities in jungles and hidden ruins beneath modern developments. Several independent research teams acquired access to this technology and turned their attention to the Richet structure. What they found reignited the entire debate about the site's origins. LiDAR mapping of the formation revealed features that were not visible in standard satellite imagery. Linear formations beneath the sand extending from the rings outward in radial patterns, too regular to be natural water channels. Rectangular anomalies in areas between the major rings, possibly indicating buried structures. Subsurface density variations that suggested human modification of the landscape. Ground-penetrating radar detected what appeared to be cavities and dense strata at depths, consistent with construction rather than geological formation. The patterns showed symmetry and organisation that geological processes do not typically create. In several locations, the radar returns indicated possible walls or foundations beneath metres of accumulated sand and sediment. The researchers released their preliminary data online, posting detailed images and analysis to open access platforms. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Researchers, enthusiasts, and curious observers from around the world began examining the data, offering interpretations and additional analysis. The conversation exploded across social media and academic forums. Within days, something strange happened. The original data files began disappearing from the platforms where they had been posted. Links went dead. Archive sites reported that the files had been removed for terms of service violations, though the specific violations were never clearly explained. Researchers who had downloaded the data found their copies corrupted or inaccessible. The teams who had conducted the scans reported harassment and intimidation. Anonymous messages warned them to stop their investigations, their funding. Sources received complaints about their work. Universities where some of them held positions suggested they focus on less controversial projects. The pressure came from multiple directions simultaneously, creating an environment where continuing the research became professionally and personally risky. New restrictions appeared on access to remote sensing data for the region. Satellite imaging companies updated their terms of service to restrict use of their data for certain types of analysis in designated sensitive areas. The RIAT structure was added to these restricted zones. Anyone requesting high-resolution imagery or attempting to use advanced analytical tools for the site found their access blocked or their results flagged for review. Digital elevation maps that had shown the detailed topography of the formation, maps that had been publicly available for years, suddenly vanished from open archives. The organisations that hosted these datasets claimed they were undergoing routine updates, or that licensing agreements had changed, but the maps never returned. What had once been freely accessible scientific data became unavailable, forcing researchers to rely on older, lower-resolution alternatives. The accusations of digital suppression grew louder. Researchers claimed that international heritage agencies, possibly under pressure from the Mauritanian government or other interests, were actively scrubbing the internet of information that might support non-mainstream theories about the site. They documented patterns of content removal, search result manipulation, and access restrictions that went far beyond normal data management practices. Defenders of the organisations involved pointed out that data management decisions are complex, driven by multiple factors including privacy concerns, international agreements, and resource limitations. They argued that seeing conspiracy in routine bureaucratic actions was paranoid and counterproductive. If researchers wanted access to better data, they should work through proper channels rather than complaining about censorship. But the proper channels led nowhere. Applications for data access were denied or delayed indefinitely. Requests for clarification about policies went unanswered. The system seemed designed to prevent investigation rather than facilitate it. The situation created a paradox. The very restrictions and suppressions that alternative researchers complained about became evidence supporting their theories, while also making it impossible to gather the proof that would definitively settle the question. If the data showed nothing interesting, why restrict it? If the site was just geology, why fear investigation? The vanished revelation, data that existed briefly and then disappeared, became more powerful as a legend than it might have been as evidence. Every attempt to suppress information about the Richat structure only increased interest in what might be hidden there. And through it all, the formation itself remained unchanged, a circle of stone in an ocean of sand holding its secrets close. The legacy of the eye. More than 2,000 years after Plato wrote about Atlantis, we find ourselves no closer to definitive answers. The story has taken us from ancient Greek philosophy to Cold War intelligence operations, from geological surveys to conspiracy theories, from satellite imagery to digital suppression. Every answer raises new questions. Every piece of evidence admits multiple interpretations. The Richat structure may be exactly what mainstream science says it is, a fascinating but entirely natural geological formation, an eroded dome that coincidentally happens to match some details of a mythical city described by a philosopher who had no way of knowing about it. The correspondences could be nothing more than coincidence, the patterns nothing more than pareidolia, seeing meaning where none exists. Or it could be something else entirely. It could be the final resting place of humanity's first great civilization, a city that thrived during the Green Sahara period, a place of learning and culture that was abandoned when the climate shifted and the desert consumed everything. The stories of that city could have survived as oral tradition for thousands of years, passed from generation to generation until they reached Plato as the legend of Atlantis. The truth may lie somewhere between these extremes. Perhaps there was a settlement at the Rishat structure during the African humid period, nothing as grand as Plato described, but significant enough to leave memories. Perhaps the geological formation inspired myth-making among ancient peoples, who saw it and tried to explain its perfect circles. Perhaps Atlantis is real in the sense that all myths are real, containing kernels of truth wrapped in layers of embellishment. What we know for certain is that the questions remain unanswered, the restrictions on research continue, the data stays suppressed or unavailable. The official explanations satisfy some, but leave others sceptical. The conspiracy theories proliferate in the vacuum of hard evidence. The Risha structure forces us to confront uncomfortable possibilities about our own history. How much have we forgotten? How many civilizations rose and fell before the ones we acknowledge as the first? How much of what we call myth might be distorted memory of real events? We live in an age when we can photograph the surfaces of distant planets in extraordinary detail, yet we cannot seem to properly investigate a formation on our own world. We can decode ancient DNA and peer inside pyramids with cosmic rays, yet we cannot get permission to dig in a Saharan rock formation. The contradiction reveals something about how knowledge is controlled, how narratives are protected, how certain questions are discouraged, even in an age that claims to celebrate scientific inquiry. Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Rishi structure is not what it is, but why we're not allowed to find out. Every barrier to investigation, every missing data set, every denied permit becomes part of the story. The structure itself may be silent stone, but the silence around it speaks volumes. If there is nothing there, prove it. If it is just geology, demonstrate it conclusively. Open the site to thorough archaeological investigation. Release the data, allow the research, let the evidence speak for itself. If the Atlantis theories are wrong, serious investigation will prove it and put the matter to rest. But that is not what happens. Instead, we get obstruction, suppression, and silence. We get bureaucratic barriers and digital disappearances. We get warnings to stop asking questions and suggestions that certain topics are best left alone. Why? That single question hangs over the entire mystery. Why does anyone care what researchers conclude about a remote geological formation? Why do authorities react defensively to theories about ancient civilizations? Why are resources dedicated to controlling information about a place that supposedly has no significance? The answer may be simpler than any conspiracy theory suggests. Perhaps the problem is not what might be found, but what it would mean if it were found. A civilization that predates the accepted timeline of human history would require rewriting textbooks, reconsidering theories, acknowledging gaps in our understanding. It would mean admitting that our confidence in knowing the story of humanity was misplaced, that there are chapters of history we have not yet read. Institutions do not like admitting they were wrong. Established narratives resist change even in the face of contradictory evidence. Academic reputations are built on specific interpretations of history, and challenges to those interpretations are seen as attacks rather than opportunities for discovery. The machinery of institutional knowledge protects itself, not through deliberate conspiracy, but through simple bureaucratic inertia and the human resistance to paradigm shifts. Or perhaps it is more sinister. Perhaps early expeditions did find something at the Risha structure, something that governments decided was too destabilizing to reveal. Perhaps the suppression is deliberate, coordinated, designed to keep humanity's true history hidden for reasons we can only guess at. We may never know which explanation is correct. We may spend generations debating the meaning of a circle in the sand, but the eye of the Sahara will remain, patient and unblinking, watching us struggle with the mystery it represents. Atlantis was never really about a lost city. It was about loss itself, about how time erases what we build, how nature reclaims what we create, how memory fades into myth and truth becomes legend. It was a warning about pride, about the fragility of civilization, about how quickly everything we know can be swept away. And somewhere in the Mauritanian desert, beneath rings of ancient stone and centuries of sand, that warning waits. The first city of humankind, if it ever existed, does not call out to us. It simply exists, silent and forgotten, a reminder that we are not the first to walk this earth, with grand ambitions and powerful technologies. Others came before, others built great things, others were forgotten. We like to think we are different, that our civilization is permanent, that what we create will last forever. But the Risha structure teaches a different lesson. It teaches that the earth is patient. It teaches that time is vast. It teaches that everything eventually becomes dust and mystery. Look up at satellite images of the formation, at that perfect bull's eye staring back from the surface of our world. It looks like an eye because it is one. It is the eye of history itself watching us, waiting to see if we will remember what it remembers, if we will learn what it has to teach. The story of Atlantis ends the same way in every telling, with loss, with forgetting, with mystery. The story of the Risha structure may end the same way, buried under bureaucracy and silence rather than sand and time. But the questions it raises will not stay buried. They will continue to surface, generation after generation, until someone finally decides that the truth, whatever it is, matters more than maintaining comfortable certainties. Until that day comes, the Eye of Atlantis watches and waits, patient, eternal, unanswered. And perhaps, just perhaps, when we finally understand what we are looking at, we will also understand what we have been missing all along, the story of who we really are, written in rings of stone beneath an ocean of sand, waiting for someone brave enough to read it. Thank you for watching. If this story made you think differently about the past we think we know, consider what other truths might be hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect the dots. The world is full of mysteries, and the biggest mystery of all might be why we have stopped asking the questions that matter most. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never assume that history has already told you everything there is to know.